Esther chapter 4 is where we'll be today, Esther chapter 4. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Jonathan. I'm one of the assistant pastors, and be in prayer for our pastor and his wife as they are away today, but they'll be back with us next week, and I know they'll be fired up, ready to join with us back in. But I'm excited to be here with you today as we continue this series in Esther chapter 4 in our time together. Well, 19 years is how long I had with my trusty Honda Civic, and I love that car. It was a great car. I remember taking my wife on our first date in that car. I remember taking our daughter home from the hospital in that car. And so many wonderful memories I had in my little black Honda Civic, and it was just, I love that car. And finally, it gave up on me. And it didn't go in a graceful way, just right in my driveway. No, it had a dramatic farewell, and it left me stranded in Menifee, California, when it was over 100 degrees outside. But that's a whole other story for another day. I got ready to go look for a new car, and I thought I would go with an electric car because, you know, the future and all that. So I get this electric car, and the first thing I did was I got a adapter for the 220 outlet in my garage so that I could run my dryer when I wanted to run the dryer, and then I could switch it over and charge the car when I needed to get a charge on the car. And it seemed like a genius move at the time. And so shortly after that, my wife and I were getting ready to celebrate our wedding anniversary, and I made plans, special occasion for a dinner in L.A. And it was one of those nicer restaurants that when you make the reservation, they don't let you just cancel it. No, they have a policy that if you don't show up, they're going to charge your card for the full price of the meal. And so I thought, you know what, this is no problem, we'll be there. And so the night before, plug in the car, make sure it's all ready to go. The next day, we're all dressed up, we get into the car, I put the car in gear, and I looked at my battery is on low. And I thought, what in the world? And I go examine, and I look, I had the car plugged in, but I hadn't switched it back from the dryer to the car. And so here we are, sitting all dressed up in our garage in a glorified golf cart that only has about 12 miles of range, with a non-refundable dinner waiting for us in L.A., and it was not the most romantic way to get our anniversary started. Maybe that's happened to you before, and maybe it hasn't been with a car, but maybe your phone. You go and you think you plug it in overnight, and you wake up to realize, oh, it wasn't plugged in, and now you're getting the day started with a low battery, trying to figure out, how am I going to get through the day? And that's a major bummer when it comes to your car and when it comes to your phone. But here's the thing, sometimes we're living life that way. We're living life, we may be close in proximity to power, maybe we come to church, but we're not actually connected to God and connected to His people to receive that power that we so desperately need to go through life. You see, that's the difference between just being in close proximity and actually being connected to God's power. And that's what this sermon series that we're going through about rules for the road, and we've hit these different principles and these different benchmarks along the way. And today we're talking about how we're created for connection. God designed us in a way so that we would be in fully connection with Him and fully connected with His people. And that's where we see the most growth and the most benefits in our spiritual life. And it's not just enough to be connected, and you may think to yourself, well, I have community and I have connection in my life, but it's not just enough to be connected because we want to make sure that we're connected to the right people and connected to the right community. And there's a couple of warning signs that we can have in our lives that let us know whether or not we're connected into the right community. And this isn't really in the notes, this is just kind of by way of introduction, but there's three warning signs in our lives to figure out, how is the community that I'm in right now? And the first warning sign that we can look for is, are the people that we're connected to, are they giving us bad advice? Are they giving us bad advice? Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly." You ever been getting advice from someone and halfway you think through, this is a terrible idea? This is the same reason why we wouldn't take financial advice from someone who's broke. We don't want to take life advice from someone who does not have a biblical framework for making good decisions in life. They don't have a perspective of a paradigm where they view life through the lens of the Word of God. And so we want to make sure, one of the warning signs if we're involved in the right community or not is whether or not we're getting bad advice. Another warning sign, if we may be in the wrong community, is if they're encouraging us to make bad decisions. Are they encouraging us to make bad decisions? Sometimes we got to be careful that we don't confuse loud voices for wise voices. And we have to be careful that sometimes people are so quick to encourage us. I would have just quit right there on the spot if that were me, or I would have just told them off if that were me. And we got to make sure that we're getting good advice from our friends, good advice from our community. And the last warning sign to look to make sure that we're connected to the right people is, are they causing us to lower our standards? Is the people that we run with, the crowd that we're in, are they causing us to lower our standards? And, if you're surrounded by dysfunction for long enough, dysfunction starts to become normal. And we want to make sure that we're not surrounding ourselves with the wrong type of people. And so those are just some warning signs for us to look for as we seek to develop the right type of community, the right type of friends in our lives. And there's going to be a tension. There's going to be a tension in this because obviously God knows just how important it is for us to have the right type of people in our life. But the enemy also knows how powerful community is. And as a result, there's going to be a tension in our lives. And being surrounded by the right group of people is going to be something that there's going to be a battle for in our lives. And we're going to be pulled and convicted by the Holy Spirit to make sure that we're surrounded by a good crowd. And you better be sure there's going to be a temptation. There is going to be a lure from the devil to pull us into that wrong crowd, because he knows just how powerful the right type of community and the right type of friendships are in our life. I've experienced this in my own family. I'll give you an example. Ever since my daughter was little, anytime that we would go to an amusement park or anytime that we would go to the fair or something like that, I would always try to just get her to get out of her comfort zone a little bit and get on some of the more exciting rides, so we have to ride the baby rides all day. And so I'd say, hey, what do you think? Maybe we ride the one with dips. And no, Dad, I don't like those rides. No, Dad. And say, okay, well, maybe the next year or the next trip we wait around. She's a little bit older, a little bit more mature, maybe more brave. And so, hey, what about this time we'll get in the ride? This one, it's not too bad. It'll be good. What do you think? No, Dad, I don't want to ride that. No, Dad. So finally, a few more years goes by. I just resorted straight out bribing her. I'll buy you ice cream, if you get on this ride. Don't you want a churro? If you do this, well, no, Dad, no, I don't want to. And so whatever I did, I couldn't help her overcome this. Well, then one time she went to SeaWorld with her friends. And they wanted to ride the roller coaster. And guess who found her courage that day? She got on that ride and she came home and she says, these rides are awesome. We want to do oh man, I want to have more of this. And I thought to myself, man, what took me years of trying to help her overcome this, one trip in a matter of minutes with her friends, and that was a whole new story. That's the power of community in our lives. There is power there. God knows that there's power there. The enemy knows that there's power there. And we have to make a decision about how are we going to respond to this in our lives, and how are we going to make decisions as we go through this. God has a lot to say about this issue in our life, and that's why we have Esther chapter 4 in the Bible for us. In Esther chapter 4, the Persian Empire and the king of Persia had, the Jews were in captivity at this time. So the Jews are in captivity, and the king of Persia makes a decree that all the Jewish people are to be destroyed. Now, Esther is the queen, and she has this position of in royalty here. And there's a man named Mordecai who is her cousin. And when he hears about this decree that all the Jewish people are to be destroyed, he goes and he tells Esther, hey, maybe you could use your position of influence to help us during this time. And Esther begins to waffle, and she says, I don't know. And she reminds Mordecai that if she were to go before the king uninvited and try to influence him in this decision, she could be killed because that was against the law. And she sent message back to Mordecai, and she reminds him of this, telling him that, hey, my life is in danger if I try to do this. And that's where we pick up our story in chapter 4, verse 13. Mordecai responds back to Esther. In verse 13, he says, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. He said, Esther, don't think that you're just going to get out of this because you happen to be in this position of authority. And in our lives, in our calling, we're not called just simply to a life of comfort and convenience, but we're called to a life of obedience and faithfulness. And so we pick up in verse 14, Mordecai tells Esther, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall the enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether thou art brought to the kingdom for such a time as this." Mordecai reminds Esther and says, "Hey, Esther, it's possible God's been working in your life and he's brought you to this occasion for this purpose." And in our lives, every relationship, every trial, every moment that we've gone through in our lives has been a part of God's sovereign plan for our life. It's been woven into your plan to prepare you for where you're at today. That's part of God's work that he's been doing in our lives, and he was doing this work in Esther's life, and Mordecai reminded him of that. If this was a movie, this would be the point after where Esther hears this, where a look of resolve would come across her face. A look of determination now resides within her. Verse 15, "Then Esther bade them return this answer to Mordecai, 'Go, gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat or drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish.'" There are two things that are present in Esther's life right now. The first is surrender. Saying, "God, I give it all to you. I lay it all down." The first is surrender, and the second is obedience. I will go into the king. I will do this. I will step into the calling that you have for my life. And when we combine that posture of our heart before God to say, "God, I'm going to surrender and I'm going to obey. Whatever it is that you're calling in my life, God, I'm going to surrender. I give it all to you. I'm not holding anything back. It all belongs to you. Any good thing that I have in my life, it's come as a result of your goodness in my life anyways. God, I give it all to you. And not only do I give it all to you and surrender it all, but I'm willing to step forward into obedience for what it is that you want in my life." That takes courage. That takes courage. And so here Esther is, and she's ready to go, take this step. And we see in verse 17, "So Mordecai went his way and did all according to that Esther had commanded him." Everything hung in the balance in the life of Esther and the life of the Jews at this time. And here she is, and she's ready to go. And she did this because she had the right people influencing her around her, and the right people around her to help support her in this trial, in this difficult time when the stakes were high. She had the right people around her at that time. And that's the importance of having a good community. That's the importance of having the right voices in our life to help us take these steps that God would have us to take. And we'll learn a little bit later on about the ramifications and the consequences of these decisions. And so with that in mind, with this passage in front of us, with the remaining minutes that I have here this morning, I just want to pull from this passage 4 helpful reminders for us to take with us when we consider this idea of community and this idea that we are created for connection. The first thought for us to think about today is that we are positioned with a purpose. We're positioned with a purpose. In verse 14, Mordecai reminds her, "And who knows that you have come to this position for such a time as this?" And sometimes we see our roles, whether at work or in family, the neighborhood, or in ministry, as isolated. But God placed us in specific communities to fulfill His purpose. He uses relationships, even uncomfortable ones, to call us to His purpose. And all throughout Scripture, we see examples and patterns where God is at work preparing someone for a role that He has for them to step into. In fact, a good example of this is Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 1:5, the Bible says that before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, Jeremiah, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee and ordained thee to be a prophet before the nations. So before Jeremiah was even born, God had a plan for him to say, hey, I have a plan for you. I have a great plan for you that I'm going to use you as a prophet. And before Esther came to this position as the queen, God knew that He had been preparing her and had a purpose and a plan for her in the palace as the queen. And God has a plan for your life. And he's been actively working in and through your life, preparing you, molding you, shaping you for what it is that you're facing today. And what it is that you're in front of, and maybe the circumstances and the trials and whatever it is that you're in front of, those various situations God has placed you in. Just as he's prepared Jeremiah, just as he prepared Esther, he's prepared you for what you're going through today. You're positioned with a purpose. Think about where you're positioned right now. God is always doing about 10,000 things in your life, and sometimes we may only be aware of about 3 of them. But you don't have to know how the story ends to trust the one who's writing it. We're positioned for a purpose. So the first thought, we're positioned for a purpose. The second thought is that isolation breeds intimidation. Isolation breeds intimidation. In verse 11, Esther was intimidated. She initially hesitated, knowing the danger of approaching the king uninvited, and if she were to be left alone, she may have let fear stop her. But Mordecai's challenge broke through to her. And it broke through the isolation and gave her courage. And sometimes we can't even see the potential in our own lives until someone else points it out for us. Several years ago, I was going through a pretty difficult time in ministry. I was very discouraged. There had been a lot of disappointments, and things just weren't going well. You ever heard of those people? It seems like anything they touch turns to gold. Well, this season, I just felt like anything I was touching was turning to garbage. It was just not going well. And I was struggling, and it was a difficult time. And I remember that there was a friend in ministry who saw what was happening, and he was able to talk to me one day, and we were meeting, and I remember he looked across at me. And I can't remember everything that was said in the meeting, but at one point he looked at me, and he looked right at me, and he said, "Do you know what your strengths are? Do you know what your gifts are?" And I thought, strengths? Gifts? Like, I don't really think I have any of those right now. Things aren't going well. And he said, I've had an opportunity to observe you, and I've had an opportunity to see some things, and let me tell you what your strengths and your gifts are. And he went out to go point a few things out to me that I wasn't even aware of on my own. And I don't remember everything that was said, but I remember those things that he pointed out to me and what he shared with me. I remember how he made me feel. He fired me up. He re-inspired me. In fact, I wasn't looking at difficulties in ministry as trials and burdens anymore, but rather now I looked at that with a new perspective to say, hey, God's equipped me with some strengths and some gifts that I want to go attack, and these are challenges to overcome now. I was re-inspired to approach what it was that was in front of me. In fact, I don't want to be too over-dramatic here, but I don't even know if I would be standing here preaching today if it weren't for the words that he shared with me in that moment. This is the power of community, godly people that we allow into our lives to share with us and to encourage us and to let us know that, hey, God is at work in your life. God is doing good things in your life, because sometimes we can forget all that it is that God's doing when we're surrounded by a cloud of isolation. And when we get surrounded by that cloud of isolation, intimidation starts to creep in. Fear begins to creep in. We begin to question things that we knew at one time that were very fundamental to the things that we believed in. And when that happens, isolation has a way of wrapping us around in a fog of uncertainty. Sometimes you need someone else to remind you of the truth when you've forgotten it yourself. Ecclesiastes 4:9 and 10 says, 2 are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe unto him that is alone when he falls, for he has not another one to help him up. Hebrews 10:20-25 says, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Isolation breeds intimidation. But a third thought for us to pull from this today is that faith is a team sport. Faith is a team sport. In verse 16, Esther says, go and gather all the Jews and pray for me. She did not act alone. She called on people to fast and pray. And this was a moment where the right support and the right community made a tremendous impact for good in her life. And the great thing about this is that when the trial came, she already had the infrastructure prepared to handle the trial. And that's why it's so critical for us to begin developing that infrastructure of healthy community, begin to develop that infrastructure, spiritual community in our lives, so that when, not if, but when those trials come and when those difficult times come, that we'll be prepared and ready for that because we're surrounded by the right group of people. Faith is a team sport. Think about a team sport. Any of these successful teams that work together and see good victories and they see championships and so forth, they're able to do it because there's so many people on the team working together to do their part to see a victory. Unless you're the Chiefs, you also have the refs helping you. But that's a whole other story altogether. But if you're working together, everybody working together to see their part, doing their job, it all collectively works together for the good. And this is where we see, hey, everybody working together, we can see a good thing done for God's glory. And this is a critical component of faith. And that's why small groups are not just an extra option, but we believe that they're essential. Small groups are not just another church activity, but they're a biblical model for how we're supposed to live. You see, all throughout the New Testament, the Bible describes these one another. And there's various times where we're supposed to practice these one another's in our life so that we can put that to use and practice authentic New Testament Christianity. I know that some of the best friendships I've developed in my life have come as a result of living out the one another's in Scripture. And this is so important. There have been times where we've had needs in our lives, and it's been a result of those in our small group have been a blessing to us. And when one gets involved into a small group, so many things happen as a result. But the three that come to my mind immediately is you get to experience the ABCs of authentic Christian living: accountability, belonging, and care. You know, as you get involved into a small group, someone might learn your name, and you might learn someone else's name. And if you're not around, someone may think, where were they? You know, that's one of the reasons why I like going to the gym and seeing people there, because when you have a trainer and you have people who are helping you, if you don't show up, they are like, hey, where were you? It's good, you know. And sometimes coming to church, being involved in Bible study and prayer with each other, that's like hitting the gym spiritually. You know, sometimes these disciplines can be so difficult to develop, and they can be so easily lost, but they're so beneficial for us. Having the right gym plan, having the right nutrition plan is so beneficial for our physical health. And yet, these disciplines that we can build up spiritually, these ones, we shouldn't neglect those because they're beneficial for our spiritual health as well. And there's a component to this. Now, so you might think, well, what exactly is your hope for Coastline and for small groups? Well, it would be the same hope that the New Testament church had, that everybody be involved in a small group, that everybody participate in that. And you know, it's easy to be a part of a crowd on Sunday morning, but you really start to become part of the church when you step into community with fellow believers. As you get connected with God and as you get connected with His people, you step into that authentic Christian community that was so evident in the book of Acts. And what happened in the book of Acts? Well, the church was on fire and the gospel began to spread and a great work was done for Christ as a result of that hallmark of Christian community that was taking place. And so let me encourage you to step out, take that step, and be a part of a small group. They start this week, and this is the best time to get on board and jump in and be a part of what's happening. What does the Bible say? Well, James said, confess your faults to one another and pray for one another. That's an element that we do in our small groups, pray for one another, and that you may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. The Apostle Paul in Romans 15 came to a point, and he was going through a difficult time in his life, and he asked the believers who were around him, hey, pray for me. Jesus, as he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he in one of the darkest nights of his life, he asked for people to pray for him. Esther, when she was getting ready to go into this trial where she had to go before the king, and everything hung in the balance, what did she say? She says, please, pray for me. The Apostle Paul, Queen Esther, our Lord Jesus, all had an infrastructure of spiritual community, of people around them who they could turn to and say, hey, I'm going through a difficult time. Please pray for me at this time. If it's important for Esther, if it's important for Paul, and it's important for Jesus, it's probably in our best interest as well to have a group of people, to be involved in spiritual community that we can go through in times of those trials so that we can receive that spiritual community that we so desperately need in those difficult times. Faith is a team sport. And lastly, we see that your obedience unlocks others' freedom. Your obedience unlocks others' freedom. If we fast forward to the end of the book of Esther, Esther 9:22 says, "As the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies." Esther went forward in obedience. She obeyed. She went before the king. And as a result, the Jews rested from their enemies. And the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Esther's bold step in her life wasn't just about her, it was about delivering her entire people. And when we say yes to God's call, it affects the lives of everyone around us. Esther's courage unlocked freedom for an entire nation. And similarly, your decision to step forward into the calling that God has for your life can have a significant impact in those around you. It can have an impact on your marriage, an impact on your kids, impact on your parents, impact on your family, your extended family. The impact that you step forward into God's calling, especially as you get involved in spiritual community, can have a tremendous impact on those around you. Your greatest fear may be the doorway to your greatest act of faith. Consider that. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul reminds us, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Our call isn't to comfort or convenience, but our call is to be faithful and to simply step forward in obedience with what it is that God has for us. In 1793, there was a man named William Carey who was a shoe cobbler in England. And there he was just working on repairing shoes. And he felt that God had placed a calling on his life to go share the gospel and preach the gospel in faraway places. William Carey shared this with some of the older men in the Christian community. And there was one old man who said, "Young man, sit down." This was his quote. "Young man, sit down. If God wanted to share the gospel with the heathen, he could do it without your power and without mine." He was pretty discouraged, but he thought, you know what? This is an unshakable calling I feel that God has on my life, and I want to press forward. And so he was able to go scrap together a couple of support from England, and he left England, and he went to India to go preach the gospel. In 1793, he arrives in England. Things did not get off to a good start when he got there. His financial support dried up in England and left him with significant poverty when he was in England. While he faced significant poverty, they were faced with tremendous illness. And his 5-year-old son, Peter, got sick and died while he was on the mission field in India. As a result, his wife, Dorothy, went through tremendous mental and physical ailments herself. It was a very discouraging time. And everything that he has going on in his personal life was so depressing and so discouraging that you think, well, at least he probably had some successes from ministry, some inspiring things that took place. No, he didn't. He did not see anybody come to Christ in his first year of ministry over there in India. He didn't see anybody come to Christ in year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it wasn't until after year 7 that he was able to see his first convert come to Christ. A man named Chappell in 1800 was baptized by William Carey. But in that moment when that convert came, something broke spiritually, and God's blessings began to pour out on the ministry of William Carey, and many, many, many people came to Christ as a result of his ministry in India. More people saw what was happening, and they got inspired, and they said, William Carey, we want to join the work in India. We want to get involved. Other people across the world saw that and said, hey, we want to take the gospel to other faraway places. Maybe you've heard of missionaries like David Livingstone, Hudson Taylor, Adoniram Judson, all attribute their inspiration to missions as a result of William Carey's pioneering efforts. William Carey has been named the father of modern missions as a result of what he had done. He is attributed with a quote that says, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. His ministry began to flourish and it began to grow. And what's encouraging about all this is that there's a family in our church today who has been reached by the ministry of William Carey. He's their spiritual great-great-grandfather. In fact, I was talking with this man as I was preparing for this, and he said, yes, his name is Moses, and he said, my cousin's name is William Carey Patel. That meant so much to the family that they just named him William Carey as a result of the influence that man had in his life. You know, as we step forward into the calling that God has for us, we may not even be aware of the ramifications that could happen as a simple act of obedience. You know, I don't know that William Carey ever had in mind that one day, as a result of doing this, there was going to be a family who's serving God in Oceanside, California, as a result of his obedience. And sometimes in our mind, we can have a narrow and a limited perspective to say, what really is my obedience really going to have on the impact of anything? You'll never know. This side of heaven, we'll never know. Remember, God's up to 10,000 things in our lives at any given time. We only may be aware of about 3 of them. And his sovereign plan is constantly at work. And as long as we have the obedience and the surrender to step forth and say, God, whatever you want, your will, not my will, that's where a significant impact can be made. There's power in community. There's going to be this tension. The devil knows it. God knows it. But may we have the resolve. May we have the determination to step forward and follow Christ in that area of our lives and be more connected to him. We're created for connection, and may we live that out in our lives. Let's have a word of prayer. Our Father,